Wicked as a property is a reimagining of the events presented in the 1939 movie Wizard of Oz. That happens to be its origin and, I believe, probably its biggest flaw. And it just so happens that Wicked for Good has now become a bit of a scapegoat for all the sins that were committed before it. Yes, I happen to believe that the main issue that concerns Wicked is it being an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation. It is basically adaptations all the way down, so let's delve into that. So the point of origin is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the original book by Lyman Frank Baum. Out of that comes the 1939 movie Wizard of Oz with Judy Garland that adapts the book. Both of these then serve as an inspiration for Gregory Maguire's book Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, which was released in 1995. So then Stephen Schwartz discovers the novel by Maguire. He likes it enough to consider adapting it into a musical. He teams up with the writer Winnie Holzman to create a play that would be known as Wicked, that would debut in 2003. But here's where it gets interesting. Schwartz only likes the idea of having an alternate take on the Wizard of Oz story to show things from the villain's point of view, but he doesn't opt to adapt the book by Maguire in a strict manner. I haven't read the book myself, but from the general view out there, the book by Maguire is way more intricate, way darker, and is not as accessible in themes that it tackles and how it tackles them. The musical, however, chooses to focus on a relatively lighter aspect of the equation the most, the relationship between Elphaba, aka the Wicked Witch of the West, and Glinda the Good. And here's where the good old process of adaptation occurs. The musical does a few things to adapt the material to be suitable for the stage. First, it makes itself way more simplified and self-contained than the book ever was. For instance, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man are made to be characters who are more involved with both Glinda and Elphaba. In the novel, while they both exist, neither Fiyero nor Bok end up being the Scarecrow or the Tin Man. There is a moment in the book where Elphaba believes the Scarecrow to be Fiyero, but that was not presented to be taken as concrete fact. In fact, Fiyero had an entire family of his own that didn't involve Glinda. Another character entirely became the Tin Man in the book. Where the book had way more leeway to stray into various territories, the play did not. You have to consider the fact that unlike a movie or a book, a play is not something that you can just put down whenever you want. You have to be economic with your time and also engaging enough so that the audience that is sitting there live isn't bored. Also, think of how many scenes you have to physically switch, the sets that you have to make and then change during the live performance. Eliminating tons of nuance and intricacies from the source also means that it brings simplicity to the plot, which also brings a change in tone. Again, makes sense in the constraints a musical has. So it also rather makes sense that the play would take various paths to basically tighten the narrative and make it more modest. It kinda makes sense that they would want to keep the narrative trajectories of characters such as Fiyero/Scarecrow or Bok/Tin Man as close to the main thread, aka the friendship between the two main leads, as possible. It is how this sort of love triangle between Elphaba, Glinda, and Fiyero were born. The main idea here is that it took steps for the format it was adapting itself to. However, Wicked for Good, as well as Wicked Part 1 to an extent, sometimes fail to do the exact same thing. So as of recording of this video, I have been to watch Wicked for Good twice in the cinemas, and I did like it way more than the first one for my own reasons, but Diva is not perfect. So let's start with some simpler observations. The movie adapts the second act of the play, which is when the play ties directly into The Wizard of Oz, and I think that if you had not seen The Wizard of Oz, you would have a really hard time getting what was happening. You see, the play does a nice thing of not focusing on the character of Dorothy at all. This isn't her story after all, therefore neither the stage show nor the movie feel obliged to show it. The play itself employs shadows and such to show Dorothy, which is cute. The movie takes a slightly more explicit approach and shows her, but never her face. Again, it is cute and all, but it does kind of complicate things for the average moviegoer. The second movie, however, also has to sort of remind you that it is related to The Wizard of Oz at the same time, but it does feel as though those relations are simply checkpoints that the movie has to go through just so you can say, oh my god, that is how the Tin Man was made. So you certainly can see how that might result in a less than optimal experience for the general moviegoer. Anecdotally, I did overhear a discussion in the cinema after the movie ended between a couple of people who were just trying to figure out what the hell happened to Dorothy and what any of that means, so it's not like I am just making up the sentiment. I will admit that I am myself not very fond of when projects do this and insist for you to have already know something to fully make sense of the plot. Sometimes it's not reasonable to expect that, although in this case I will concede that it is very likely most will know what Wizard of Oz was about, but this is only the first part of the equation. The second part of the equation is that the connections to Wizard of Oz sometimes don't even make much sense. I have to be frank for a second, I do not particularly like the implication that Wicked has, in the sense that you should know what Wizard of Oz is about, but we will not be completely adhering to it, therefore we are allowing ourselves our freedom, but you should also make sense of our plot on your own while using something that isn't even entirely canon. It is a bit of a contradictory point, sense, it sort of tries to have the best of both worlds, but it just comes off as weird to me. As it stands though, a lot of flaws have already been widely discussed, most likely in great lengths before me, so I'm certainly not providing something new here. But boy do I hate when existing fandom states things like, the flaws of the movie are overstated, because no, I don't believe that they are. The second movie, to put it kindly, doesn't really have a cohesive plot on its own, it just has some set pieces that it cycles through because it feels obliged to the Wizard of Oz and to the original play. Let's take for instance Bok's transformation in For Good. So since the movie is barely out and I don't really have scenes to show for it, I will just describe the needed material, okay? Bear with me. Oh, spoilers by the way. So the sequence basically goes like this. Elphaba knows that Nessa has become the governor of Munchkin Land, so she goes to see her and ask for her help, and they have a back and forth, and Nessa blames Elphaba for not being there and abandoning her, and asks her to cast a spell and make her feel as though she's back in the days of Shiz and Ozdust, when Bok still called her Nessa and not governor. So she does, and Nessa's shoes make her fly. Then Bok comes in and tells Nessa that he's off to see Glinda, as she's getting married. So then Nessa says, "Oh no you don't," and just takes the Grimoire and proceeds to cast a spell that shrinks his heart. Elphaba then proceeds to undo it, but turns Bok into a Tin Man so he wouldn't have to have a heart. So besides the weird questions that Nessa being able to use the Grimoire brings, this just feels too convenient for the movie to just have this happen. It is a very random bullshit go approach as far as story progression is concerned, which brings me to another point. The movie really fails to properly depict the character arc that Nessa undergoes. Because while at the end of the last movie we do see her father dying and her basically inheriting the position of the governor, how the heck did she go from that to basically having Bok imprisoned? The little that we see of their relationship, it can be explained that she just went power mad and exercised her authority to keep Bok around, but I don't think that was ever even implied to be part of her character in the first movie. In fact, it was Bok himself who came to her and chose to be with her. Then there's also the title of the Wicked Witch of the East, which I guess she kinda gets by association and whatnot, but there really isn't much material to sustain her being called that in universe. In the same plotline, when we see Nessarose just wandering around Munchkin Land looking for Bok, conveniently just as the house of Dorothy Gale arrives in, is about to fall down on her. Again, kind of random bullshit go, which just happens to be very convenient for the plot. So I feel like with her character there is clearly a whole chapter there missing. Then we also have Fiyero becoming the Scarecrow. The way it all transpires does kinda make sense, but what comes after it is a bit ridiculous. So Scarecrow joins the quest to find the Wicked Witch with Dorothy, as per the wizard's request. But he is literally her lover? Like, which I guess you can kind of make your own headcanons and stuff to make it make sense, but like whatever. What I particularly didn't entirely like is what the movie does with this, because there is a scene in Camo Co where Glinda and Elphaba talk, but then Chistory, I believe, comes in with what seems to be a piece of Fiero's uniform, and that somehow equates to Elphaba and Glinda understanding that he is dead, and that there's a whole plan in place. And to catch you up to speed, at the end of the movie, Elphaba fakes her death and escapes together with Fiero, who is now a Scarecrow, and supposedly there was a plan in place for this. I distinctly remember just squinting in confusion at this moment with the whole scrap of uniform in the movie theater, because what does that even mean? Also, the movie doesn't really explain how exactly Elphaba and Fiero came to the plan to fake her death. I suppose that this was their way of adapting what happens in the play, when under the same circumstances, Elphaba receives a letter where Fiero tells her that he is alive but must pretend to be dead. I believe in the play it is more properly communicated than in the movie adaptation. I suppose it does make sense that he would use the Kiamo Co to their advantage, as he knows the place since it belongs to his family, but like, where did the planning happen in the movie? Since for a second, it seemed as though Elphaba came to this decision on her own as Scarecrow was occupied by the journey with Dorothy. Then we also have the ending for Glinda, where she just triumphs over the wizard and Madame Morrible. Also, if you flip to M's in Madame Morrible, you get Wicked Witch. Anyway, I do think it is a bit maybe too simplified how she just walks in, delivers her piece to each of them, and that is the last we see of them. Then we also just have the fact that characters like the Tin Man go on to be forgotten by the plot. Sure, Wizard of Oz resolves it in a way, but that happens somewhere in the other media, and not in this movie. Now, just an aside, I have seen this sentiment online of people saying that other people want to be spoon-fed information when it comes to critiques like this. I would like to disagree. I don't necessarily think that these quite big gaps in information need to be filled in with massive explanations, but for some parts there is just not much explanation at all. You also have to remember that some fans have been fans for years and they already live with their headcanon of the events all sorted, which is valid, honestly, good for them. And it makes sense in the context of the play, since it has its own time restrictions and stuff. I think it is way more okay for you to do more heavy lifting in that way, but these movies are basically twice the size. Surely there was room for at least some clarity. The one thing that movie does attempt to flesh out is the talking animal subplot and them being made into scapegoats. This is very briefly present in the musical, I believe, but I do feel like this attempt is also underdeveloped in the movies. I do like a lot of ideas within the plot. For instance, it makes sense that the wizard coming from Earth in a way corrupts Oz, and it brings something that is also present on Earth, the use and abuse of animals. I do like that he basically makes them scapegoats. While very brief, there is an explanation as to why they are hated now. The first part implies it is due to the drought that happened in Oz.
When one could walk these halls and hear a snow leopard solving an equation, when and why did this change?
From what I've read, the Great Drought.
Precisely. Food grew scarce, and when people are hungry and angry, well, then they begin to look for
someone to blame.
But it is not really specified when that happened, why the drought happened, and the movies thus do not make it clear necessarily what the wizard was distracting from in the first place by throwing the animals under the bus. Its absence is not too deep. Maybe I would have just liked to see the movie dig in more as to just how corrupt the wizard is and just how much he corrupts Oz. All of these deficiencies are all notably also present in the play and are carried over during the adaptation process. And some of these issues are not only in the second movie. For instance, and this is going to be a very hot take, I never fully felt for the friendship between Glinda and Elphaba during Wicked Part 1. On paper, their relationship is simply iconic, but the execution is a bit lacking. Glinda was displayed as being straight up vile to Elphaba and was extremely mean to her out of nowhere. But after Ozdust, the movie very quickly forgets all of the vile stuff that Glinda said to Elphaba. I didn't feel like there was proper build-up to their friendship, and the movie did not at all decide to stray from Glinda being shallow up until that point. It is not the fact that they became friends that is the problem for me. I could believe in Elphaba looking past things and then growing closer, but what gives me pause is that all the vile stuff is not addressed. No apology from Glinda, nothing. You can make a case for there maybe being other ways they mended fences instead of an apology, but that part was just never sufficient for me, if I'm being honest. Maybe I just feel as though the movies can feel way too much like the main idea leading what we see on screen, rather than what we see on screen leading us organically towards the main idea. Wicked for Good specifically does feel like it is a bit of a this character goes here, does this, then this character does this, just because the plot demands it. And all of that is because the elements we covered in For Good were just never meant to make sense in that way. There is just no way around that. And that feeling, once again, is also present in the play. I think the question that I have is just, why wouldn't the movies fix those issues that clearly have their origins in the musical? And it's not that they wouldn't. I think it is more so that they couldn't. I dwelled on this for a while, and I was just left wondering whether either of the two directions would have truly fully satisfied the audience. The one thing that the play did too well was creating an extremely tight script in a sense of just how closely everything relates to everything else. Let's take a look, for example, at Fiyero. Him being the Scarecrow, while opened some plot holes and many questions, and just does not make sense as it is now, would have opened another can of worms altogether. Think of it this way. There are really two options in this scenario if you want to mend this issue. You either make Fiyero become the Scarecrow, but add just a bunch of potentially convoluted scenes and spawn a storyline to explain things that do not match up, which would then bog down the movie and add screen time that I am not sure that the movie wants to have. Or you make him not become the Scarecrow, which would eliminate a plethora of plot holes and questions, but would take away from his entire characterization. Fiyero Tigelaar is displayed on the surface to be rather easygoing when he first arrives at Chiz. He has a whole number dancing through life that is exactly about how easygoing he presents to be. The song literally has lyrics such as "Life's more painless for the brainless, why think too hard when it's so soothing," which is heavy hinting and foreshadowing towards the Scarecrow, who in the original Wizard of Oz lamented about having no brain. So if you take away his fate, you take away basically all the reasoning behind his characterization and symbolism / foreshadowing across the movies. Kinda similar to what happens with Bok and Nessa. If you try to make it less contrived, then you would either have to eliminate some things entirely, or you would have to make up storylines to make it seem smoother. Because similar to Fiyero, things were just built around a certain fate in the play for the Tin Man, therefore changing any element of that changes changes the story. Not to mention how both Fiyero and Bok's transformations contribute to no good deed. And the reason for this is because Act 1 of Wicked the play was most likely backwards engineered from what happens in the Act 2 of the play, which covers the events of The Wizard of Oz, meaning that the entire play was backwards engineered to get itself to a conclusion that was already severely lacking in terms of plot integrity, further meaning that making certain changes would result in deconstructing and reworking a great deal of the story itself. These issues are only exacerbated in the movie adaptation since Act 1 lends itself beautifully to a clean screen adaptation, whereas Act 2 relies on tying itself up to the events of Wizard of Oz, which, looking from the other point of view that Wicked gives us, doesn't actually have a cohesive plot. That part of the plot has Dorothy to tie it all together, but since Wicked makes a conscious choice not to include her, it kinda falls apart. It only makes it worse that these are two separate movies that were released a year apart. With the musical, you can always say that Act 2 was weaker than Act 1, but Act 1 was great, so I enjoyed it. With the movies, the rationale is not the same, as the thought process turns into, I love the first movie, the second one wasn't good though. And then you also have the general expectation of the fandom that already exists around Wicked the musical, and the musical's place in pop culture. One of the other issues that you can sometimes sense in Wicked for Good is the tone imbalance that occasionally pops up. Take for instance the sequence that happens after Nessa Rose is crushed by Dorothy's house. We see Glinda sending Dorothy away, then kneeling down to mourn for Nessa. The scene is nicely done. Then arrives Elphaba and asks Glinda if she can have a moment with her sister. The funny thing here is that Glinda's moment saying goodbye to Nessa is portrayed as more touching than her actual sister's, which is the first point against this whole sequence, but certainly not the last. Then the two of them bicker over the love triangle with Fiyero, and then they break out into a comedic fight. Glinda manages to call Elphaba greenie, and all of that is another point against the whole sequence, and then Fiyero shows up on scene and there are guards as well. This is quite a serious, intense moment, as it is here that Fiyero ends up taken away and crucified in the field. There are a few things to point out in regards as to how musical in the movie handles these moments. In the musical, the scenes obviously do not have as much of a cinematic gravitas. In a movie, you're obviously allowed to linger on a scene or a moment, the camera is allowed to stay here for a bit and let the emotional point land. So the whole sequence doesn't have that big of an emotional whiplash in the musical due to its format, as the emotional moments are not as intense as they are in the movie. In this sense, the movie does do a thing right. It does for a brief second linger on the emotions of Elphaba and Glinda before breaking out into the comedic fight. But in a weird way, it does kinda make sense that the movie adaptation decides to leave in the catfight between them. The catfight is kind of iconic in the musical, so I get leaving it in, but it just does not square well with the rest of the film that they are adapting. Another, I would argue, more glaring issue is the Wonderful sequence. I will grant them this. Wonderful being changed to include Glinda is nice, but that sequence still does not square well with the movie that they are adapting. The one thing that the movie tries to remedy, and does half right as we discussed, was the expansion of the animal's cause that Elphaba takes on. For Good opens with Elphaba liberating animals from the wizard's yellow brick road construction. It has a whole new song, No Place Like Home, that Elphaba sings, dedicated to depicting the struggles that the animals face due to the wizard's propaganda. The play doesn't go this extra mile, so whenever the Wonderful sequence comes along, it is way easier to stomach. The movie's Wonderful sequence, however, comes off as jarring, because it is not like we haven't been shown the cruel conditions that the animals have to endure under the wizard's rule, so it does feel kinda more jarring to see Elphaba just dancing around with a fascist dictator of the land after we see the animals that Elphaba cares so much about leaving Oz. Glinda being there narratively is cushioning for this exact reason, but you can also see why they wouldn't think to touch it or change it too much. Wonderful is probably something that is also ingrained in the discourse surrounding Wicked. It is also one of the few songs that is more upbeat and engaging in an otherwise grim movie, which all really boils down to the fact that the intention here is to stay true to the musical. The musical is, after all, quite known in pop culture and has a strong fan base. The people who made this movie are clearly part of the fan base. It does so in the process somewhat forgetting that it is indeed an adaptation, and it is allowed to change things for better or for worse, or for good. And while in this way the movie adaptations inherit both the good and the bad, it also inherits the central issue that only undercuts the movie's message way deeper than it did in the musical. You may discount the following as purely a logistical argument, but it does matter for someone like me who likes analyzing plots. I came to Wicked because I saw it as an interesting exercise in parallel storytelling and an adaptation rather than a musical. After all, this is the entire premise that both the musical and the movies hinge themselves upon. The movies especially are quite insistent on telling telling us, the audience, that Wizard lies, that what we are seeing is the real story under the hood. At the end of For Good, even Elphaba acknowledges that they, the audience, need to have the villain at the end of the day, then she accepts her fate and fakes her death, only to forever live on as the Wicked Witch of the West, who was defeated via a bucket of water thrown by a female child. Both the musical and the movies are here proposing an argument that there does exist another story under the villain of the Wicked Witch that the original Wizard of Oz presents. The musical is called Wicked Witch, the untold story of the Witches of Oz for a reason. And both the musical and the movies articulate that argument, I would say, poorly. But the movies are way worse offenders in this instance. Call me rigid, call me too stuck up, too detail-oriented, and you will be valid. It's just that in a lot of ways, I cannot look past the fact that Wicked movies just do not really stack up well against the original narrative that it tries to run parallel with. I remember like a month ago watching The Wizard of Oz in preparation and just making a lot of mental notes of what the Wicked Witch was doing and just thinking, I cannot imagine the Elphaba I know from the Wicked doing this even with a propaganda lens. The things that are shown in the movie, they still happen, canonically, because if Dorothy experiences them, that means that they do happen, right? Or also I end up thinking, that will not make sense at all. Even without viewing Wizard of Oz, I remember watching the Act 2 and also just poking around a lot of things and having a lot of questions. And I think that if I was already having these thoughts, maybe the movies are just not good parallel stories to begin with. I think it is very evident in how there are always new people online, especially on Reddit, for example, asking same questions, wondering same things, and longtime fans are quick to chime in and provide them with explanations to questions they probably also had. I think that if these questions even exist at such volumes in the first place in regards to a story that is supposed to challenge the original perspective provided by another work, I think we might just have a slight bit of a problem. It's the last thematic step that neither the movies nor the musical fully managed to take. And I will be honest that it does diminish the experience for me. It just always pokes at the back of my mind how it just does not connect. At moments it feels like it is just right there, but it does end up missing that cohesion completely, which runs contrary to the whole point of the movie. If you have to make mental leaps, backflips, and squats to make it make sense, then maybe there is no untold story in this iteration to be told. I have seen people make their own headcanons for these stories being versions of the same story, a multiverse or a parallel world in a way, which again, runs contrary to what the movie tells us, does it not? If you literally have to mentally separate Wizard of Oz and Wicked into separate universes, the point is just not that well argued. But the movie adaptations make it just so slightly worse for what they are. While the musical is 2 hours and 45 minutes, the movies are basically twice as that, and they still make the same mistakes and inherit the same issues. Twice the amount of time also means just more time to ponder upon these incongruencies. And the movies simply do not have the magic nor the exonerating circumstances that the musical has. Musicals are way more of an event that is just immersive to such an extent you can overlook a lot. Think about it. There are performers performing in front of you. You're usually more charmed by the work being done in front of you rather than annoyed at the flaws of the plot. But it would be a disservice to only focus on the flaws that this adaptation inherits, since it also inherits good things and improves on at least some of them. The one thing that musical really does focus on, the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda, does shine rather nicely and for good. While the inclusion of a love triangle is a bit outdated, you have to admit that the other elements between them are great. I specifically appreciated how they adapted the death of the Wicked Witch. The scene of Glinda hiding in the wall and them saying that they love each other was epic, and it was an extremely good touch to show Glinda watching and hiding while she sees Elphaba supposedly melt. Glinda's whole speech at the end, the audience, is epic, and when the Grimoire finally opened for her, I gotta admit, I cried like a little bitch. It did hit a bit more for me in the movie, and that I suppose was the intention of these adaptations all along. It may not be the perspective that all of the audience shares, but it is a perspective nonetheless, and it seems like it is a dominant one. Besides me making this video and thus doing the equivalent of Old Man Yells at Cloud, Rotten Tomatoes show that audience is generally very supportive towards the movie. Perhaps that indicates that there was something right in the approach that the adaptations took. So even if Wicked has quite a big adaptation problem, I would say, maybe it does so consciously. Maybe the material is adapted this way for the better, or rather, for good. You had to see this one coming. Bye!